Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Welcome back everyone. This is True Crime California, and this is part 2 of the story of the serial killer William Bill Bonin. This story's fucked up. Been a real tough experience for me researching. I gotta tell you, it's something that I wish I had thought through a little better before committing myself to it, but I think I got through the majority of the craziness last week, and this week is going to be kind of just coasting into the finale, kind of the conclusion of this story. We're going to get through this together, and then we're going to move on to probably nothing any easier or more lighthearted, but at least it won't be little boys, which is like really a tough thing for me since I have a 9-year-old little boy. Anyway, welcome everybody. I don't know if I've told anybody this, but the intro music that you hear is from a band that I was in my 20s. I was the singer. It was called Boy Beach. It was a really fun experience, really good band. It was just me and a bunch of friends. We never played that many shows, but we recorded a lot, and we played a few, and we actually got paid to play a couple times, which was super crazy. But anyway, so now every time I hear it, I want to start singing the song, which is, I don't know, is that narcissistic? I'm not really sure. But in any case, that's where the intro music comes from. It's great when you're in a band because you don't have to pay for intro music or little snippets of music because it's yours. Not that I'm making money anyway, so I wouldn't really owe anybody royalties. But in any case, I think I'm rambling because I don't want to get into this case. But I'm going to have to. So let's see where we left off. Let's see. Oh boy. Okay, yeah. So where we left off was with 12-year-old James McCabe being tortured, raped, and murdered. And then Bill Bonin, the piece of shit, being arrested on a parole violation and going to jail for, I don't know, like a month and a half, 2 months, something like that. Now, I do want to note that I believe when he picked up James McCabe, he was with Gregory Miley. And so that's important for kind of the next part. As we went over last time, Bill Bonin had a number of associates, accomplices, people that he sort of controlled and made to do his bidding. At least that's what they would tell you if you asked them, like how they came to rape and murder children. But I think it's pretty, common for people once they're, caught doing something like this to try and blame somebody else. But in any case, the last murder and a few of the last murders that we covered were with his accomplice, Gregory Miley. Prior to that, it was Vernon Butts with 2 T's. I like to call that out because he deserves the name he had. And now we're going to talk about his release and kind of what happens from there. So 10 days after Bonin is released from this last little stint in prison for a parole violation, he and Gregory Miley go out again, and this time they pick up 18-year-old Ronald Gatlin. Now, Ronald had just dropped his dad off at a restaurant and was walking home from a friend's house in North Hollywood when he was grabbed. And I just moved out of North Hollywood into Burbank. So when I read that, I immediately started to try to find where he was. I couldn't find it, but still interesting. He was tortured severely. He was raped. He was beaten. He was strangled. And he had the telltale ligature marks on his wrists, ankles, and neck. His next would-be victim. Now, I don't know exactly what happened with Gregory Miley at this point, but he seems to have kind of taken a back seat, kind of like Vernon Butts did. And so Bonin's next would-be victim, for whatever reason, became his next partner, which I guess is the better option. I'm not really sure. This near victim turned associate was 17-year-old William Pugh. Bonin did the same thing with him that he did with like all the other boys, but for whatever reason, decided not to kill him. And I think maybe they had been hanging out at Everett Frazier's party house, his like neighbor and friend or whatever. So maybe sort of the association saved this kid. It's really fucking hard to say. But in any case, Bonin scared the shit out of him. started doing like the weird sex talk. He tried to get out of the car. Bonin grabbed him by the collar, brought him back in to the car, and then started saying shit like, you know, if you kill somebody, you need to know what to do with the body. Just really creepy shit. And he liked to scare his victims. So it really sounded like he was kind of going down that way. But then he just let him go. He let him out of the car. I think he like dropped him off at home, in fact. And for whatever reason, this fucking guy just decides to keep hanging out with him. He's like, this seems like a chill dude. Like, this is my new bestie. So they keep hanging out, and he turns into his accomplice. And in fact, on March 20th, 1980, he accompanied Bill on yet another kill. Now, this victim was 15-year-old Harry Todd Turner. This poor boy, this story really sucks. I mean, they all suck, right? It's like, oh, they're from a good family. Oh, they're from no family. Like, there's no, like, one victim in the list of all these victims that is not incredibly sad. But this, I just hate hearing when like people have bad lives and then this happens. It's like there's just not a moment of good for them. Like, what could they have possibly done to deserve this? Obviously nothing, you know, but it just sucks. So anyway, Harry Todd Turner, he was a runaway who had escaped an abusive boys' home just before being picked up by Bonin. Now, when Bonin picked him up, he approached him. He offered him $20 for sex, and Harry agreed because he was desperate for money. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these boys were in the sex trade. They cannot be sex workers at 15 years old. I refuse to call them that. That's not really a thing. But they were kind of selling their bodies for money because they didn't have any other way to make money. And they didn't have family. They didn't have support. It was very much, a lot of them were like Bill Bonin when he was their age, which you would think he would feel some sort of kinship, but he certainly does not. So Harry was tied up, beaten, raped, and this time Bonin added another level of torture to the attack because, as I've noted previously, he likes to escalate every time. He bit Harry on his genitals to the point where it bled. And he did this obviously before he was killed, which is absolutely fucking horrific. Once he was murdered, he was dumped, like he's always dumped, you know, like he always dumps his victims. He just throws them out like trash. And 2 days later, on March 22nd, 2 bodies were found. So he's just like boom, 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 1, 2, 3. So 2 bodies were found on the Ortega Highway, which is outside of San Diego. These boys were 14-year-old Glenn Norman Barker and 15-year-old Russell Dwayne Rue. Now, Russell went by Rusty. Both were hitchhiking. I don't believe they were hitchhiking together, which is how I know that he was kind of like frenzied at this point. But both were met with the same horrific fate. And in the case of 14-year-old Glenn, there was yet another uptick in the torture. His body was found with a ring of cigarette burns around his neck. So we've got knives, ice picks, strangling, raping, burning, hydrochloric acid. You know, I think I mentioned the ice pick already. Like biting. It's just it's endless what this guy will do. He's fucking deranged. He is absolutely fucking evil. Now, Glenn, this is again another story that's fucking sad. They're all sad. But Glenn had been given money by his mother specifically so he wouldn't hitchhike. But he spent the money and ended up in Bonin's van. Glenn's mother, who was battling cancer at the time, suffered a really major health setback when she found out that her son was murdered, and murdered so viciously. And again, he was 14. She did live to see Bonin charged and put in prison, but she died 3 years later. So, you know, she didn't have the peace she was seeking for very long. Now, 2 days after these bodies were found, despite the police still saying there was no connection between these murders, which, like, what the fuck? Despite that, the Orange County Register came out with a story about the, quote, Freeway Killer. This is what they named him, which tied, I think, at least 5 of the murders to a single killer, with many more of these boys being listed as possible connections. They had a forensic psychologist create a profile of the killer, and his profile was almost 100% correct. Like, it was real close. What he said was white male, smart, late 20s or early 30s. He was in his early 30s, ashamed of his sexuality, And the only thing that he got wrong was why Bonin killed. This psychologist said it was out of shame, when in reality, Bonin killed for pleasure. He fucking loved it. And he wouldn't stop if he wasn't stopped by someone. And he fucking even said that he wouldn't stop if he wasn't stopped by someone. He later, when he was captured, straight up admitted this. So, I mean, it's like it wasn't a secret. Now, with police pretending there wasn't a serial killer, things weren't looking too good. So at least this case came out, they broke the story and brought attention to the case. His next victim was 16-year-old Stephen Wood. His body was found on the Pacific Coast Highway, which we call PCH, which is like a coastal highway. It runs all up and down the state, I believe into Oregon, maybe even Washington. And he was found on a portion of it in Long Beach. He was killed in the same way that all the other victims were killed. With all victims, like I just kind of mentioned, the families are destroyed. This one was a little specific. Stephen got into Bill Bonin's van because he had already met Bill. And he met him through his older brother, who was friends with Bill, who kind of ran in similar circles. So he felt safe being with Bill Bonin. And as a result, he was tortured and murdered. And this is significant because, one, it's a fucked up part of the story. And two, his older brother, 9 years after Stephen's death, waited until Bill Bonin's birthday, which is January 8th, and he did this in 1989. He went to a friend's house and shot himself to death with a shotgun. So I think it's important to note this because, again, we talk about the impact on families. This one was even more of like a crazy, like the guilt that he must have felt for introducing his brother to this fucking murderer. And that's why his brother ended up dead. It is just terrible. Like what Bill Bonin did, it stole so many people's lives, like emotionally and actually in this case. This guy was so guilt-ridden that he couldn't bear to be alive, which is super, super fucked up. Moving into April of 1980, the next victim was 19-year-old Darren Lee Kendrick, who was working, like actively doing his job, like on the clock, not even like going to work or coming home from work. Like he was working, collecting shopping carts at a grocery store when Bill Bonin convinced him to get into his van. Now, the way he did that was he told him he had drugs and that they could do them together. And the guy was like, yeah, fuck this fucking job. I'm going to go hang out. He's a 19-year-old kid. No judgment whatsoever. Unfortunately, as soon as he was in the van, the torture began. And again, unfortunately, this time the torture escalated. Darren was tied up, beaten, brutally raped. And when his body was found, he had chemical burns on his mouth, on his face, and on his chest because Bonin, as I had actually previously mentioned, forced him to drink hydrochloric acid. And in addition to this, he also had an ice pick shoved into his ear. It wasn't still in his ear, but they could tell it had been shoved in, then removed and stabbed into his spine, which would have rendered him paralyzed, and it would have been extremely fucking painful. So this is like a new level of violence, as wild as it was that at this point he could even still be leveling up. He was. Now, in a crazy turn, his next victim was actually his live-in boyfriend, 18-year-old Lawrence Sharp. The two went on dates together, like were officially like a couple. I think he even like lived with him and his mom. Like Lawrence lived with Bill and his mom for a while. I read that they went to Knott's Berry Farm, so like kind of wholesome. But after a while, Bonin said he grew tired of him. So instead of just being like, let's break up, move out, leave me alone, he fucking killed him and stuck his body in a dumpster. I just don't even I don't know. So that was, I believe, a solo killing, as was his next victim. Now, his next victim was 14-year-old Sean King, solo. He had asked Vernon Butts to join him, but he said no. So Bonin, undeterred, went out on his own. This poor boy's body was not actually found until after Bonin was caught. And the reasoning behind it was interesting. So apparently the victim's mother begged Bonin to tell her where the body was. She wrote him a letter begging for mercy. And I guess the letter kind of did it. But Bonin, if you asked him, he said, no, it wasn't the letter. It's because I knew when the cops took me to find the body that they would get me a hamburger. So that was his thing. And I got to tell you, I do think that maybe it appealed to his, like, I don't know, empathy, the tiny bit of empathy that he maybe had somewhere deep down. But he wasn't willing to admit that because he's such a fucked up person that he had to be like, no, it's because I wanted a hamburger. I really believe that. Like, everything that I've read, people are like, oh, that's how stone cold he is. And I'm like, no, that sounds like an immature, like, kid being like, no, you didn't make me do it. I did it because I wanted to do it. And this is why I did it. You know, like, it sounds really, like, petulant. So I think that the letter really worked. But in any case, Bonin finally told police where the body was because he got a burger, which is stupid. So, you know, I don't know. If what he says is true, he's just another example of him being a trash bag human. But at the very least, he's just immature and needs to make excuses, right? So around this time, he had not been caught yet. And Bill Bonin met a drifter named James Monroe, who he invited to live with him and his mom. Now, this was after the boyfriend moved out. So he invites James Monroe to live with him. And his mom, of course, knew nothing, right? Had no idea. So anyway, they move in together and they're actually like sleeping in the same room, but in different beds. And Bonin even got this guy, James, a job at his work. James later said his first impression of Bill was that he was a good guy and, quote, really normal, which I think your radar is off. You have some judgment issues there, clearly, my guy. So anyway, the two somehow get to the topic, you know, of raping and murdering little boys, and James is apparently open to the idea. Which again, like, I'm just shocked how many people are like, yeah, that sounds like a great way to spend a night. Like, what the fuck, guys? Crazy to me. What is wrong with y'all? But anyway, he was down, and I have to say, I'm actually really excited about this because this is going to bring us to our last victim. Yay! Last murder victim, I should say, because shit gets a little weird. And this victim was 19-year-old Stephen Wells. So we had Stephen Wood, and now we have Stephen Wells. Stephen initially agreed to go back to their house and have sex with them for some money. And after they were done, you know, they offered him, I think, like $200 to tie him up. And he said, sure. So they tie him up, and then immediately Bill Bonin starts raping him while James is in the other room watching TV. Now, James said he didn't participate in the consensual sex or the rape, but he was there when this was all happening. After a while, Bonin calls for James to come in, and James comes in. He's like, yo, dude, this is crazy. Please fucking stop. Now, that's the weird thing is, like, I know that he was prepped for this through their conversation. And then he gets to the point where it's actually happening, and he's saying, I don't really want to do this. But Bill is like, it's too late. This guy's going to die. We gotta just do this. So James beats him with Bill Bonin, and this poor kid, you know, he's begging for his life, and then they strangle him to death. James Monroe later described the murder, saying that Bonin was screaming, but like excitedly, and telling this poor young man that he was going to die, just basically trying to scare him as much as possible before actually ending his life. He said Bonin was extremely excited and animated while strangling him to death, which again, like, how could his mom not know this? If he's like in their shared home screaming and attacking someone, it's like, give me a break. You know, there's no way that she didn't fucking know. So, oh, I did want to mention, sorry, I forgot. His father was dead at this point. So he wasn't around anymore. He died. But he still was with mom, and she had to know. So in any case, they go and they dump this young man's body behind a gas station in Huntington Beach. And he then threatens James because I think he can tell that James is kind of like, whoa, this wasn't what I, you know, thought it was going to be like, and I don't want to do this anymore. So he threatens James and he says, you know, if you tell anyone, I'll fucking kill you. And during this time, again, because Bill really likes to ramp up the fear and intimidation, he tells him, I'm the Freeway Killer. I have multiple accomplices and they will know where you are. They will know who you are and they'll fucking kill you if you tell on me. And then he told him, I killed 45 people. And now this could be taken as him trying to scare James, or it could be taken as truth. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But at the time, what was true was that, the Orange County Register, despite the police being upset about it, really did help bring Bill Bonin down and stop his reign of terror. Now, this is the case for many reasons, some of them obvious and some of them not so immediately obvious. The first obvious reason is this brought the cases of these murders to the public's attention, which is huge in collecting evidence and finding witnesses. Second, Bill Bonin became obsessed with collecting news clippings about the murders and would talk about them incessantly to anyone who would listen. In fact, he kept a scrapbook in his fucking van, which makes sense because, he kept everything else in there, weapons, fucking evidence of murder. Which is, very, very dumb, but it's not like the scrapbook was like the thing that broke the case. But he did have it in his van, which is ridiculous. Everett Frazier, the party neighbor, said that they would often talk about the killer and that he would often say, Frazier, that he wished the police would catch him. Beyond Bonin creating a piece of evidence to tie himself to the crimes via the scrapbook, there was also a very important witness to come forward. And that witness was the previously, 15-year-old David McVicker, the boy who had been raped way before the killing began. And I will remind everyone that Bill Bonin went to prison for this attack. So David McVicker knew exactly who it was that raped him. And he noticed a lot of similarities between his attack and the murders. McVicker went to the police pretty much as soon as the story broke and said straight up, like, hey, based on the pattern, this guy's your fucking killer. Police were super interested in his story and they did believe him. But also they had another eyewitness come forward around that same time, which was like the spring of 1980. And this witness was William Pugh. So there's some names from, his past, not so far in the past, kind of coming forward to haunt him. Now, William Pugh had been, present for at least one of the murders and had recently been picked up for grand theft auto. Not wanting to get into trouble for car theft and also not being very smart, he thought he could use his knowledge of the murders to get out of the theft charges, which, like, bro, you're gonna get murder charges instead? As this doesn't seem like a good exchange. Pardon me. But anyway, he took the chance. Bonin definitely wasn't known for hanging out with geniuses. He tried to skirt his own responsibility, William Pugh, when he was like, who went by Billy, by the way, when he was talking about the murders. He did say he knew a guy who had a scrapbook about the murders in his van who he thought might be suspicious. Later, he would testify against Bonin for a reduced sentence once the police kind of, figured out what he did. But that name, having now come up between two people with some pretty interesting information, got the police very interested. And with this information, police went and talked to Everett Frazier, the neighbor, and they later said that they could see the realization come over him while they talked. They said, once they told Everett here, your neighbor, your friend, he's the fucking freeway killer, they literally watched his arm hairs like raise. Like they stood on end because he was just like, oh my God, it all makes sense. He's definitely the killer, right? He then agreed to give them any information he could to help, which is great. The guy sounds not awesome, but at least he's doing the right thing. And with all of this, police began to focus on, meaning surveil, Bill Bonin. Sadly, they did not get to him in time to save his last victim, but they did get to him before he could murder anybody else. The really sad thing, talking about the timing, police began surveilling Bonin the night that he killed his last victim, but they started right after he dumped the body. So that was June 2nd, 1980, which is fucked up. So Bill, I think he kind of knew, that he might end up getting caught, and he obviously, didn't want to. So for a time, he started acting right, we'll say. He went to work every day on time, drove trucks all day, then either went home or went to Everett Frazier's house, which had to be super stressful for Everett because, now he knows what's going on. But to police during this time, he seemed normal. Work, home, or with friends, go to bed. And considering how back-to-back most of the murders were, like, who knows if police were like, nah, this isn't the guy. Maybe police were like, oh, we can tell he's just trying to throw us off, Luckily, it took only 9 days for Bonin to need another kill. So while laying low was a good idea, he wasn't really able to keep that up. He went out cruising on the night of June 11th, 1980, and police watched as he unsuccessfully tried to pick up 5 different young boys from the street. Finally, after a few hours of trying, he picked up a 15-year-old and drove him to a secluded beach parking lot. Police followed, and when they finally busted into the van, Bonin was already simultaneously raping and strangling the boy. Sorry, my dog is barking or sneezing. And I think the reason that he was being so quick in his murder was that he was alone. So he didn't really have an audience. So I don't think it was as exciting for him to torture these boys. I think when he was alone, it was maybe more about just the kill, the rape and the kill. He didn't go to the same lengths that he did when he had an accomplice because, again, he likes having that audience. Luckily, like I said, police were almost too late, but they did make it in time to save this boy, traumatized as I'm sure he was. Bill was arrested and booked on suspicion of murder, as well as multiple sex charges. And at first, Bonin refused to talk. But remember how I said that letter from Sean King's mom seemingly worked? Regardless of what he said later, that letter was in fact the last thing he read before he decided to confess to Sean's murder, as well as 20 others. And I just want to say that it later came out that the letter was never written by Sean King's mother. It was written by a detective. And this detective later told Bill Bonin this, and I kind of love that. Because as much as I am not a fan of cops, I love when killers who think they're fucking smart and think they're above it all get fucking humbled a little bit. So I did really enjoy knowing about that. Either way, Bonin, he started to confess, and he confessed over several days, horrifying detectives in the process, not only with details of the tortures and murders, but with sort of the casual nature in which he told the stories, coupled with the fact that the only time he became anything other than borderline bored with the stories was when he became excited about them, which was usually when talking about the point at which the victims died. So he was either very matter of fact or enjoying the tale a little too much. But there was never a hint of, remorse. There was never a hint of regret. He just was either bored or kind of turned on, which is absolutely fucking insane. In the end, he gave up details about 21 victims and also gave the names of every one of his accomplices. In the end, he was only charged with 14 murders, but also robbery, sodomy, and mayhem. He would have been charged with more, but the evidence apparently just wasn't there, which is a bummer. As in reality, he is linked to at least 20 other victims, which aligns pretty closely with what he said to James when he said he killed 45 people. So that's kind of where that number comes up again, because it sort of makes sense. Even though we don't know for sure, there are definitely a lot of names floating out around that they think are tied to him. And in fact, even to this day, they're trying to link him to other murders using DNA. So far, I haven't heard of any success with that, but it's definitely an interesting thing that they are still, to this day, looking for connections. Almost, 30, 40, God, I'm old, almost 40 something years later. They're still trying to solve these cases, which I love that they're doing that, because everybody, they deserve the closure. In any case, so he would have been charged with more. They couldn't really get the evidence, but they did start picking up his accomplices. And on July 25th, they picked up Vernon Butts. They found evidence of at least one of the murders in his home. And Vernon fully admitted to everything, saying that Bonin had a, quote, hypnotic effect on him. He also detailed the use of the ice pick, acid, and knives on the victims, and said that Bonin, quote, loved to hear them scream. James Monroe was the next to be arrested. He had skipped town after Bonin was arrested, but they caught up with him in early August and nabbed his ass. In mid-August, police nabbed Gregory Miley in Texas, where he had run after hearing of the arrests. He also admitted his role, giving more details of the murders he took part in, which apparently were only 2, but it was enough to put him away forever. Now, as the trial was coming, police were dependent on Vernon Butts for a lot of the testimony. He was the biggest accomplice. He was there for more of the murders. I think it was 9 of them or something. And unfortunately, in January of 1981, he hung himself in his jail cell with a towel somehow. Some people, including his defense lawyers, say that maybe he was actually murdered. He received a lot of threats, which people who rape children get a lot of threats in prison, and they definitely get murdered in prison, as we'll see. But so I don't know. But everybody, the police seem to think it was a suicide, which I don't really know if that counts for much. But in any case, he's dead. January 1981, he died. And I believe that this is a big part of why they weren't able to charge Bonin with more murders, because one of their main witnesses was gone. And in fact, after all was said and done, in LA, he was only charged with 10 murders, even though they tied him to 21. Now, he had another trial, but in LA, there were 10. During the Los Angeles trial, because there was that other one in Orange County, which I'll talk about, it became pretty clear that he had perpetrated the murders. You know, some of the victims had green carpet fibers in their pubic hair, which matched the green carpet in his van. We also have the witness testimony. We have his own confession. We have, David McVicker's eyewitness of what happened to him. So, the case is just building up pretty good. It was pretty clear that he did it. So it became more about his defense trying to defend his actions or explain his actions, get the jury to sort of, feel bad for him more than anything. His mother took the stand and she talked about the beatings that he endured as a child. To back this up, actually, doctors looked at him and said, he has severe scarring around his head, which indicated significant trauma, basically to his brain, probably, potentially at a very young age, kind of lending to the idea that this was pretty major was the fact that when Bonin was asked about it, he didn't know. He didn't know how he got those scars. He didn't remember the beatings. He remembered a lot of trauma, but he did not ever remember what exactly led to the scarring around his head. So that's crazy, because that's probably just like a trauma block. Doctors also found evidence of frontal cortex trauma, which is significant because that's what controls your impulses, or lack thereof if it's damaged. So between, the brain trauma, his horrific childhood, to be fair, Bill Bonin did not stand a chance. There's no way that he was going to have a good life. That being said, I still don't feel bad for him beyond his childhood, because, you could have told somebody that you couldn't control yourself, but his lack. So, okay, here's what I think. The impulse to murder was because of what was messed up in his brain. The lack of remorse is because of how he was raised. So some of it is like, yeah, it's his brain, and some of it is just him being like a stone cold piece of shit, not giving a fuck, regardless. He didn't give a fuck. If he didn't have the brain damage, would he still have murdered? Maybe. I don't think that's off the table when you have a life like he had. But the brain damage definitely did not help. But in any case, the jury, was given the case, they presented it to them, and after just a few days, they came back with the verdict of guilty on all 10 counts of murder. Bill Bonin was given multiple death sentences, and at the Orange County trial, it was much the same. 4 more convictions, 4 more sentences, and his accomplices were handed pretty tough sentences as well. Pugh, for his cooperation, was given, I think, 16 years or served around that much. Gregory Miley was given life with parole. Now, they were going to put him up for the death penalty, but he agreed to testify against Bill. So they said, okay, we'll give you life with parole. So at some point, you can have parole. I know that I mentioned that Gregory Miley was not a very smart man, and I'm going to just kind of circle back to that. He was a dumbass, and basically he just fucked up the whole time in prison. He got in trouble for rape. He got in trouble for all sorts of shit. So he was never, ever going to get out. And actually, some years ago, he was beaten to death in prison, probably because of the crimes that he perpetrated. But it took, I think it was like the early 2000s when he was killed. So it took some time for that to happen, but he died in prison. James Monroe, the drifter who was there only for the one murder, was given 15 to life, but so far is still in prison, with the family of his victim coming to each parole hearing to ensure he is never released. And David McVicker also comes because he does not trust that this man who made the decision to partake in this was told about it beforehand, said, yeah, I think that's a good idea, and then went through with it. He doesn't believe that he's a good fit to be in society. And I don't really disagree. James Monroe is so miserable in prison that he's actually requested the death penalty so that he can just end it all, which good, I guess, if you're that fucking miserable. But also, he said, I would have never agreed to the plea deal of 15 to life if I knew that it actually meant I was going to get life. I would not have agreed. I would not have cooperated. I would have pled not guilty and tried my luck. And I guess that's just what happens, when you hang out with this kind of guy. So sorry, dude. I did also want to say that while he kind of has written letters to the family saying he's so sorry, this, that, and the other, every single time he comes up for parole, he really paints himself as the victim. He basically says, I was scared, Bonin made me do it. So he's not really taking responsibility. And that, that could be true. He was kind of afraid of Bonin, but he could have just left. He didn't have to stay living with him. He didn't have to kill the guy. He was told ahead of time what was going to happen. He could have just said no. So in any case, I don't feel bad for this guy. Now, Bill Bonin, for his part, like I said, he got a lot of death sentences, and he was put to death via lethal injection. Now, this is the first prisoner in California to die this way. They had outlawed the gas chamber as being cruel and unusual, and it's so fucked up. One of the books that I read about Bill Bonin, they actually detail the way the last prisoner to die in the gas chamber died, and it made me a little sick. Something about it was so detailed and fucked up that it made me feel queasy, which not great. Don't recommend reading that. But in any case, it did drive home the idea that the gas chamber is cruel and unusual. I'm anti-death penalty, just to put it out there, just in general. I think it's a bad idea. When it's something like this and it's an open and shut case, I still think it's a bad idea. And I hate to say that because Bill Bonin sort of agreed with me. And he said as much in his last words, which I probably won't talk about too much. But in any case, he was set to death. His date, the date was, February 22nd. But he actually died February 23rd because they started the injection at 12:01 a.m. I guess they do it in the middle of the night for some reason. I don't really know why. He died February 23rd, 1996, just after midnight. His last words, really, they offered nothing to his victims' families about remorse or anything of any value. He basically just said, I don't believe in the death penalty. I don't think it is a good example. He said basically, the youth of America don't do what they're told. They do what they see. And I don't think he's entirely wrong. He also said something along the lines of, if you're considering breaking the law, you should really think twice. Because obviously, he didn't want to end up dead, and you don't want to end up like him. He, over multiple interviews, said he was at peace with dying, but didn't really know how he'd feel in the moment. And he said, I don't think anybody will know until they're in that situation. I don't think I'll know until I'm in that situation. But however he felt, he did get to find out. February 22nd and 23rd. His last meal consisted of 2 large sausage and pepperoni pizzas, 3 gallons of coffee ice cream, and either 2 or 3 6-packs of Coca-Cola. He ate these alone. I don't know. How much could you possibly eat? If I eat more than a pint of ice cream, I feel like I'm going to die. But maybe that was the point. Maybe he wanted to feel so gross that it would be a relief. I don't know. I often wonder. It's what is the point of gluttony until the point of being sick? But in any case, Diva always from Twisted Listers, she always really enjoyed talking about the last meals of inmates when they were put to death. So I wanted to do this to sort of pay tribute to Diva because I love her. In any case, after his death, the families tried to put their lives back together to varying degrees of success. But in all honesty, I think the effects of what he did affected the families and, the public at large for many, many years. It's just really fucked up. And I also wanted to note that nobody came for his body. They just left him. They're we don't want that. And that's about it. That's the end of the story. This is part 2. I didn't have a full hour, but I didn't want to do an hour 45 and I didn't want to leave anything out. So I thought splitting the story made sense. Thanks everybody for listening. This is a really fucked up tale. The craziest part is that there was another freeway killer operating basically around the same area at the same time. There were multiple other serial killers in this area at this time. And so it's really crazy to me that the police refused to admit there was one, let alone multiple, really says something about the time, I think, the time that they were living in back then and how the police operated. So he got away with a lot more than he probably should have, and hopefully more than a serial killer would nowadays. We don't really hear that much about serial killers. People say, oh, they're operating. There's 50 in the United States. It's really not very many. It's crazy. It's terrifying. It's way too many, but it's also not that many. And I feel like back at this time, there were like that many in California. So I don't know what was happening back then, but this is a really fucked up case. I'm glad it's over. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I have not chosen my next case, but I will do so soon. You all will know in about a week what that is. If you guys have any requests, feel free to email truecrimecaliforniapod@gmail.com. Please like, rate, review, share with friends and family. Follow us on Instagram, us meaning me, on Instagram. I'm really trying to build this up. My last podcast had a really good following, and I'd love to get there with this one as well. I think it's possible. Hopefully my storytelling is interesting enough that you all want to keep coming back, want to listen to more. But if there's anything you want me to do, any cases you want me to cover, anything you want to hear in particular, tell me. I'll do it. I'm stoked. I'm down. And also, I am now a part of the Darkcast network, which I'm super proud to be a part of. There's some really good and popular podcasts on there, so I feel like I'm just in the best company. Check out all the other podcasts on there. And until next week, everybody stay safe.